I want to first of all thank all of you, especially those of you who are coming from different other parts of the world. We are really heartwarmed to have you here. And then we see when others may be showing up. And I'm going to transfer this to David, who will tell us about what systemic diversity is about, and then we can proceed from that. David?
Oh, good. Welcome. Welcome, everybody. Good to see you, and some of your faces I've not seen before, but glad to be seeing them now. I'm glad everyone could join us. So the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group, SDIG, this really started as a dream, a very big dream about global engagement and social justice change, but really it's more a simple formula. We believe that if you have dialogue, that leads to awareness, and the awareness can lead to change. And so we're all about dialogue, shedding light on social issues, D&I issues, and these type of things. And we want to do this from a hub where professionals, interested parties, people with experiences can all come together in this forum to shed light on these social issues. We'd like to have people come in that have knowledge to share, ideas to share, experiences to share. And we think by having that discussion, we become more of a think tank to address all these issues that are kind of plaguing our planet at this point in time. Humanity issues and those type of things. But the key to all of this is having knowledgeable people like yourselves, people with experience, people with knowledge in these areas come together and have these talks. And that's why we're here today. That's why we're here many times doing the same thing for this one reason and one reason only. We just believe that this type of dialogue can shed light on issues and lead to solutions to some of these issues. And that is why we're here today. Correct, Joseph?
All right. Thank you very much, David. And I want to say that we're gonna have like 3 parts to this. The first one is that we're gonna ask our honorable panelists to, introduce themselves and then try to relate their work to the issue David had articulated. And then we're gonna go through that, then maybe secondary questions may come. Then after that, we will move to the panelists, not panelists, I mean the audience who could then pose their questions. And then we just get at it and have lively discussions about these issues. But before we begin, I would like to say this. I had wanted to place this on this, but I couldn't. Just think of this COVID-19 that we are currently experiencing. No one should be told about the implications of it. And I was looking at something from Great Britain. They were talking about Downing Street. The commissioner has urged people. He says, commissioner of, wait a second, let me get it right. Community Secretary, Robert Jenrick, I'm putting here. I'm putting him here. He says, there does appear to be a disproportionate impact of virus on BAME, B-A-M-E, communities in Great Britain. Now, that's over there. Then if you come to the United States, all the series that are increasingly talking about 70% being dead, they are talking about the situation, what had caused it. And I'm like, when I think about it, I feel like, okay, we know what may have influenced the disproportionate deaths, but that's not what I want us to look at. What I want us to look at is, why did we allow this type of things to happen? What can we as individuals do to ensure that this type of thing doesn't happen again? What can we do as group or people we are associated with to make sure we call the attention to some of these issues? So if we do those things, I do believe very strongly that we wouldn't be having these binary discussions all the time, white or black, red or yellow, whatever dimension you want to look at it, and we continue to have this type of discussion. So that's why I'm so pleased that we have eminent people who would give us something based on what we are seeing and hopefully find a way to go forward. A friend of mine, Dr. Bouncy, says that for whatever situation, he called it turbulence, there's always two dimensions to it, the risk aspect of it and the opportunity aspect of it. So what I would like to see our distinguished panelists is to give us something in context of what are the opportunities we have, especially in education where everything begins. All right. So let's go to Saba. Saba, would you introduce yourself and tell us what you do and relate it to the issues we are talking about?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. Hi, so I'm Saba Holmes. I'm a people inclusion consultant. I create bespoke solutions to inclusion, BAME, and people management problems faced by managers and organizations, the public and private sector. I also consult on diversity, on equality, operational HR, policy, process improvement, and inclusion solutions on an independent project basis. And I develop bespoke training, presentations, and workshops to facilitate conversations that really are the conversations perhaps we don't always have as D&I professionals, but that we need to, so that we actually start to cross some of those barriers between who the insider and outsider is in all our work in community spaces. What I try and do is really just try and just plant the seed for getting people to open their minds in order to create realistic and sustainable institutional policy and cultural changes. So how my work aligns with SDIG is, I believe in the power of creating change based on stories, creating awareness through education and sharing learning from lived experiences. I think that's really, really powerful. And while we have pockets of people who do this, we don't really see a lot of this in the mainstream. I also know firsthand, having worked with more than 140 different nationalities, that communicating beyond our differing opinions is absolutely possible through the right kind of shared narrative, which, if it's created, it can penetrate age-old views and create a shift in perspective, which is a starting point of planting the seeds for change. If you manage to do it tactically and strategically in organizations, whether they're public, private, particularly the education sector in schools and universities, while remaining authentic and not sort of being swayed by whoever's in power telling you to, quieten it down, then change can really have an immeasurable impact. And I think, schools, universities, training providers, and developers, they're extremely important in this context because, like Joseph said, this is where it starts. From when you have your children exposed to nurseries and basic schooling, right through universities and before they become, adults and part of the civic population entering the workforce, what they're consuming, what they're learning, what narratives they're hearing and seeing. This will define their view of the world. This will define how they work with other people in working spaces. This will define with how they will interact with people within their communities. So a lot of my work just involves assessing, where and to whom I can provide the results of my learning through the kind of solutions that can work for them, and really contextualize the solutions that actually works with where they are in their journey. So that's a little bit about me. And while I'm working as a consultant at the moment, the place I'm now going to start focusing on is writing and actually sharing a lot of these insights more so with people, because I think that's the opportunity that the current situation provides us. I think, the risk of constantly working in the same place that we were stuck in is lessened now that we're all stuck in the same shared space. So I have invisible disabilities. I am across 8 of 9 protected characteristics in the UK, and that are listed in their Equality Act. And I can tell you absolutely that intersectional stories and lived experiences are not talked about enough. and we don't talk to each other enough in minority groups, nor do we let our organizations, our education systems, and our communities learn about those experiences, because we're just quietly being resilient all the time rather than talking about what we're learning through all our challenges. So that's where I'm going to focus, and I hope that that is what will help SDIG and people that I work with. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Jennifer Blalock, can you tell us about yourself and tell us, jobs you do and connect it to our mutual view in utilizing SDI in order to move forward?
Absolutely. Well, Saba, I hope I said your name correctly. Thank you for your courage and your servant leadership heart, and everyone on the panel. It's a pleasure to meet you today, and I look forward to continuing these courageous conversations as we go forward. I am a first-generation college graduate. I often say that my autobiography would be called From Government Cheese to College Degrees. And Seba, what I loved what you just talked about is sort of that quiet resilience. I wrote it down because I think so many of our students, so my passion, and I've had the privilege of never really working a day in my life because I fell into my vocation of open access, publicly funded higher education, which I believe is a right and I believe is transformational. And so, I'm 47. I grew up in the age when we didn't have the internet, when information wasn't quite as accessible. And so I know that it really was sort of miraculous that I knew how to fill out my FAFSA and do all those other things. You know, my mom had an 8th grade education, and she got her high school diploma when I was in kindergarten. She didn't have a driver's license, and we grew up in a very cold climate. So we would take the city bus, and I would watch her study. And she eventually got her driver's license and moved on and was able to do other things, but we still lived below the poverty level. And so I think I work in higher education, as I've shared. I am a big proponent of what work can we do to not only get students access to higher education, but champion them through. The psychosocial impact of, if you've never read Bridges Out of Poverty by Dr. Ruby Payne, but learning about sort of, those transferable skills, the cultural changes, the sociological impact, and really, again, the self-awareness, right? That self-advocacy that it doesn't come naturally to everybody. We're, based on how our nature versus nurture, all those environmental and external factors. How do we help our students? And by students, I use that term to anyone who wants to learn. And I think we have to really blow up some of those hard, fast definitions of what it means to be a learner or a student and who we're preparing for, because right now we're all in this together. We've got to maintain that sense of collaborative learning. We've got to create an open source, open access knowledge base and conversation discussion to empower everybody and to give them the opportunity to inform and direct their own journey forward, whatever that means. We look at things like parent engagement, and we have very traditional norms of what that means, right? They've got to come to a parent-teacher meeting when our parents are working 2 and 3 jobs or don't have transportation. We've got to look at our justice-involved youth who at 16 are being told things like, you aren't even eligible based on your criminal record for a minimum wage job. We've got to help people continue to redefine their narrative. Not one of us is perfect. Not one of us hasn't made a mistake, but all of our opportunities for learning continue to help define and redefine who we are and who we're becoming. The only constant is change. And so change leadership is about courage. It's about integrity, transparency, honesty, and vulnerability, which is something we don't always embrace. I know that's an area I've always got to work on as well, but having the courage to share your story and creating a learning environment that invites and celebrates the way we all learn. I am the parent advocate of a 22-year-old who is a senior in college who was told in 3rd grade she would probably not graduate high school. Those kinds of things, and she had an advocate in me. What about those kids out there who don't have advocates, who don't have that person that says, you know what, no one's going to define you. No one's going to tell your story at 9 years old or 12 years old because you can't sit in a desk for 8 hours like everybody else, those kinds of things. So I am looking for what I can do to contribute to the global creation of learning environments that are open, inclusive, and meet people where they are and celebrate that we all learn differently. And that's a beautiful thing. That's a liberating thing. And that's what's going to really, in the end, in my opinion, be the saving grace of humanity. So excited to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's really great to have you guys. Listening to both of you kind of gives me some hope. David?
Yes, sir.
You wanna shoot your gun or?
Yes, I will actually, because honestly, I have some questions I wanted to pose to these panelists, and I had them thought out ahead of time. But I'm going from that because I heard them say two things that were very very common with each other, centered on the topic of education. And one other thing I said specifically by Jennifer was this idea of vulnerability in stories. My own perspective, and I'll just touch my background, is primarily working with government and nonprofits, not so much in the education arena, but I do agree that oftentimes we get to these issues too late in life. Working for the government, for example, we would get people that the first time they even talk about D&I is mid-career. I mean, what good is that going to do anyone if people aren't getting a D&I training until they're 30 years old? And so I want to come back to this topic of education real quick. And personally, to me, the power of stories is really huge. And one thing I always thought, if we could just get more stories into our school system to open students' eyes, but maybe that's not the only thing. And this is what I'll pose to our panelists. What are some of the other ways? And I understand, I think one of the biggest pushbacks is superintendents and principals that are loath to have these controversial things done within their school systems. So how do we overcome that to make sure that more of these conversations do take place within the education realm, whether it's K-12 or at the university level, just anywhere other than waiting until people are 30 years old to have D&I conversations? So I'll pose that to either Saba or Jennifer.
Would you like to go first, Jennifer?
No, you go, Saba, and I already typed some things in the chat as
Yeah,
well.
and I agree with you. I think those are definitely good starting points. I can speak from my experience as not just, I'm a current mature student as well. I'm studying a master's in psychology and neuroscience and mental health. And I can't tell you how difficult it was to feel like I had all the information at hand. I could even develop a sense of belonging or be wanted by an institution. And I kind of hopped and skipped around a lot in the UK. Now I've been an international student. I've obviously been a student myself, like everybody has. And I think, we, in addition to everything you've said, Jennifer, I think we also need to create spaces for our teachers where they can learn to talk about these things. I think very often there's very little support in place for teachers and educators. So working at the universities in the UK and having studied there, it was a complete, there were two sides of those equations that I suddenly, learned 20 years apart, which was, as an international student, I was never quite a fit. 20 years ago, going to someplace up north in the UK, I was one of the first few brown faces there. And my tutors didn't know how to deal with some of the issues I was facing. I was 17 when I went, and I had some major milestones in the UK. Like me, many international students face the same thing, but they don't have representative stories that they can associate with, that they can feel like, yeah, there's a bit of me in there. They are struggling with some basic things like food and so on, which is the same if you move from a big city to a small city or a small city to a big city, regardless of your ethnicity. So there's a lot of common themes that we tend not to explore because we somehow in our storytelling end up fitting within just the race perspective or just the gender perspective or just, the LGBT plus perspective, because they are important perspectives and they are, deferring parts of identity. But I think a lot more needs to be done to talk about ourselves in education first as full individuals. I think our system the education system can do a lot in terms of what we teach. So there is a lot of information I only now realize I grew up learning that was not of my culture or made from authors that I could relate to. So I thought, I can't be a writer. I can't be successful in XYZ position because I don't see anyone in those positions. Same thing for teachers. You know, if they are miserable in their jobs, they're not going to teach high quality stuff to students, which means the students are only going to learn what the teacher feels they can cope with and are able to teach. And if what they're taught to teach is colonized curriculums or curriculums that don't reflect them or their experiences, then what you get is an entire education system that just, you know, is sort of driven by whatever perspective is in power in that particular school or that particular community or that particular region of the country. And this happens across the world. So I think we need to start re-examining what we're teaching, how we're teaching, what support we're giving to our educators. Are we making it safe for them to speak up? Are we hearing minority voices regardless of ethnicity? Are they, you know, in UK where I am, the largest population is of a white minority, but they have no ability to speak. And they are people who work in your education system. The university is a major employer in Lincoln in the UK. But these educators cannot speak because they feel, well, I'm not Black or brown, so I'm not obviously struggling as much, so I can't actually speak. But this is where you then lose the quality you can put into what you're teaching and developing for these students by way of exposure to inclusion and inclusive mindsets and, you know, just how to live and work and understand people who are different, who sound different, who look different, who practice their life differently. So I think those for me would be some really core areas that I would personally love to go back and be able to look at, because if I've struggled, I know people who weren't as privileged as me or who weren't as outspoken as me have probably struggled even more with it. And I feel for my teachers and my professors who, you know, didn't have that voice given to them by the organization.
Those are all
you.
great points. I was just going to share real quickly, Joseph, and I'll promise I'll hurry, but I think that we have moved away from creating and engaging in conversations, you know, rooted in civility, acceptance, and curiosity, right? You know, when you look at uncertainty reduction theory, one of my favorite communication theories, it's the idea that we are reticent or fearful of things that we don't know about. And the whole purpose of communication is to mitigate that uncertainty. And so having courageous conversations in a safe, nurturing, and accepting environment really promotes that. But I wanted to share in Duval County, I'm in Jacksonville, Florida, and every year we participate in something called the Youth, I don't know if it's every year, but it's a normed survey of high school students called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey Index. And we've got some alarming numbers, but one of them that was really interesting to me, that I was talking to a young man who works for Equality Florida. And it was a number, there's a really high numbers of students who have thought about self-harm, who don't feel accepted, but the students expressed that they were fearful at school. And so our natural inclination would be they're concerned about violence of their peers. Of course they are. However, they're also afraid of not being accepted by their teachers. And by being there, exposing their true self, whatever that is, whomever that is, and not being accepted, being judged, those kinds of things. And so you're absolutely right, Saba. We've got to provide the support and resources to our instructors and teachers so that they can understand it's a new world, it's a changing world, it's a fluid world, and the norms and sort of that black and white, you know, these lines, the lines aren't there anymore. We're allowing ourselves to be our full expression of human beings. And so that doesn't mean that people don't want to learn. It's just something different that we have to talk about in a safe space so they can work through it and accept it. I also wanted to share that if we sort of disrupted, which I think we're doing right now because of COVID-19, the experience of education and made it more on demand and reflective of the real world, we spend so much time, and accreditation is important. I'm not saying it isn't. However, that whole process, by the time a curriculum, it's not reflective of real world, it's not inclusive. we have the same, you know, in many cases you're on the 15th, 16th edition of the same book and nothing changes but the cover, right? And to Saba's point, you know, excuse me, it's got to be more reflective, more inclusive, and we need other titles and other authors so that we have different perspectives, and so that the narrative continues to change because our you know, our understanding is exposed and the frameworks change. So I would say you know, really encouraging curiosity. And I just want to give a shout out to a young group of young people in our community. We have a lot of youth violence, and some young people pulled together a group called Young Leaders of Today. Rodney Wells is the young man that pulled it together, and they've been doing town halls called Let the Youth Speak. And the truth of the matter is that if you want to know what young learners of all ages, what their thoughts are, what they care about, ask them. We spend so much time dictating what people need from other groups, when instead we should all just be listening and learning from each other.
Absolutely.
Thank you
And I
so
think it's the
much.
same for teachers as well. We rarely ask our educators what would they like to be teaching, to assess. A lot of what I've unfortunately seen is that information is driven top down and you're just told. And if you happen to be a minority in whatever sense, even if it is, you know, that you're the only person with disabilities or the only person with experience around bullying and harassment and whatever it may be, that whoever holds the power gets to define what is taught. And that can be quite damaging because it's not reflecting the values that the organization may actually be putting up, you know, as being the values we want to pursue. And that disconnect creates a lot of disengagement among learners and those who teach them. So I absolutely agree with your points.
I want to jump in if I might. I'm a special education teacher as well as a director of disability and higher ed. So my life, it revolves around disability and education. I come with a lot of knowledge and experience in that field. I love you ladies for sharing that because everything you said is spot on. On the flip side, I think SDIG really needs to start having this conversation of culture and understanding who our youth are, who our parents are. Because the fact is we have an opioid epidemic, we have trauma, we've got pornography, we've got human trafficking, we've got rural communities that are dealing with serious, serious issues. And then they have children and then they come to school. And then we hope that they've been fed. We hope that they've got their basic needs in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But they don't. The reality is our cultures and our world are trying to educate children and families that aren't equipped to absorb learning. Though it's beautiful to say we'd like to educate and create this, and you didn't have this resource. They are struggling and there's problems out there. And so I don't know what an answer is. I just wanted to show that side of how difficult and complex this issue really is.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And I think, you know, for me personally, coming from a South Asian community and observing people not just like me but different to me struggle with very similar aspects of being able to share their experiences and be understood across different generations. So whether you're youth in your, you know, and you're in your teens, or you are an adult and I'm, you know, close to my 40s, that issue never actually goes away, because I'm not sure what it is in our education system that doesn't encourage more challenging of the status quo. And this is not just education system in one particular country. I mean, I've done my higher education in the UK, studied in an Indian school in UAE. And I can tell you a lot of different, you know, we had the American system, the Canadian system, the British system, and all of it. And somehow learning is very prescribed. And I think people, you know, kids today and young adults today, they don't really want prescribed learning. They want to be able to question narratives. And there's something in terms of a barrier in how education institutions define how to teach that I think can be changed. And I have seen some work that I've done around in Lincoln University start to at least get them to think about how you might be alienating certain students, whether they are white students coming from really, really rural communities, because Lincoln's a very rural town with only one major university, very young. So, you know, that's a very specific example, but there's lots of places in the world that are exactly like that. You know, people come from rural communities don't get university education. It's a complete culture shock for them. We've had children and you know, students come from London and they're completely shocked in Lincoln because it is 97% white or something like that, but it's in the 90s and 90+% white. So if you are any minority ethnic group, white or black or Asian, or you know, you are any other minority for whatever reason, whether it's disability or your sexual orientation, you will find it very hard because Lincoln is very, very different. And so like that, every city has these peculiarities. But I have started to wonder if we think about the context in which learners are learning and therefore then amend our cultural teaching or have an element around cross-cultural understanding and communication, you know, introduced. But it can work because I've seen it work and I've worked on those kind of projects. So it can work, but it's a lot of hard work because you're challenging the way things are done. And for me, that was a real challenge. Education institutions like universities and schools, they are fearful of stepping into the unknown, which I found very contradictory and very troubling, but also intriguing to have to try and shift some of that, you know. So I absolutely agree with you.
Well, funny.
Question. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Just a second, please, then you can ask. I wanna welcome Dr. Bossi. He's the one whom I stole his ideas when I began this session. He's the one who talked about, you know, what he described as turbulence, and that for each one we have a means through which we have to look at either the risk factor or we look at the other factor, which is the opportunity. And that's what I really want us to look at, because I think the knowledge you brought here is just it's too much. And could you imagine if what you are saying is actually being implemented in schools? If you go to Saba's statement when she talked about, you know, vulnerabilities people who are different may face, you know, it's not just students. You could see it among faculty members, you could see it among staff members, you could see in all categories, because all those things are the dynamics we see in school. And David, go ahead, you know, I can come back later.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We'll come back to that. I really like the topic of risk versus opportunity as well. And the words I want to contrast were something Jennifer said, and I want to tie it back to what Saba was talking about, equipping teachers. But Jennifer used the term courageous conversations. I came from an organization just before I retired within the government where we didn't use the term courageous conversations. We used the term difficult conversations. And that's the way they thought because they avoided them at all costs. And that's one of the reasons I'm so in love with a group like this, is because I understand that we have to have these conversations, and these courageous conversations, as I prefer to have them termed. And so I want to kind of tie this together before we move on to another subject, is maybe it's not even equipping teachers, and maybe it is teachers, but those people that are able to have those kind of conversations, how are they equipped? And in your experience, who have been best able to do that, to help host those kind of conversations, and how have they been equipped to do so?
Jennifer, would you like to go first?
Sure. I'll share very quickly.
Oh, sorry, Tabitha.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, you said Tabitha. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I did say Jennifer, but I noticed Tabitha was trying to speak for a while.
Sorry, I will be very quick, and then we'll turn it over to Tabitha.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just a second.
What I would share, I'm sorry.
Okay, I was gonna say this particular section is a section for the panelists. So the questions are gonna be going to the panelists. After this section, then the next section will be the time audience will be asking questions. Okay? All right.
So sure, great. I was going to share one of the most important things that we have to do is, instead of having these conversations in our comfort zone and in our safe spaces, so for example, on campuses, you know, in our secular sanitized business, you know, businesses and things like that. We need to meet people where they are, where they're comfortable. And then the other piece is we don't need to direct the conversation. We need to let control go and embrace true, genuine collaboration and be willing to hear things we may not like about ourselves. Be willing to hear things, and instead of immediately becoming reactive or defensive, be open to, okay, I respect your perspective. I'm going to learn from that. And then let's be solutions oriented. I think we have to not personalize it, but rather globalize it in terms of being motivated by what's best for learners, what's best for our global community, not what, oh, this is uncomfortable for me. There's going to be discomfort. And if you can do that in a safe space where you appreciate and honor and really come from a place of love. I don't mean that to sound you know, too Pollyanna or superficial. I believe if we come from a place of love and communion and connection, that we all want the best for each other, that's the safest place to start. That doesn't mean, love doesn't always mean we agree. It doesn't mean we're always going to be on the same page, and it doesn't mean there won't be some pain along the way.
I agree. I think my experience, you know, I absolutely agree with that. One of the toughest parts I've had to deal with, whether it's been an HR business partner role working with, you know, 140 plus different nationalities across different levels in organization, or it's been working as a race and equalities and inclusion lead at the university or in other positions within HR. The difficulty is always how do you facilitate? And I think you have to have the right people, whether it's a community or work or education space, you have to have the right people who can facilitate these conversations. So and I've also found useful working with both white minority groups, white majority groups, and BAME or Black and Asian minority ethnic groups, that it's okay, and a lot of people don't, you know, feel uncomfortable about this, but it's okay to have 3 separate safe space conversations, each for those groups, and then figure out when they're ready in their journey to bring those groups together to interact with each other. The easiest way to cross those boundaries and to get people learning how to have these conversations earlier is building racial resilience. Now, ethnic or minority community people, you know, they build racial resilience all their life, because when they wake up in the morning, you see yourself in the mirror, you know you sound different, you look different, you are different. There's no getting away from it. But if you've never been exposed to it before, or you've never grown up in a city that is diverse enough, or you're coming from rural parts of the country where it might be your first time moving away from home for education or work or whatever it may be, you'll be shocked, because people are not going to turn up at the same time as you, because they have different, you know, different cultural belief systems or learnings around there. They're going to act and eat different food. They're going to behave in different manners. They might dress differently to you. They'll wear hijabs and niqabs and whatever is their, you know, way of representing their faith. And it can get very uncomfortable, and rightfully so, because if you've grown up white, or you've grown up in a particular community and you only know that community, whether it's Black, white, or brown, or whatever, and you've never stepped out of those boundaries before, you will find it a shock to your cultural system, and you won't know how to engage. So part of learning how to engage is, I think, you know, you've got to target community initiatives. I think you have to target within universities. Incredibly important to try and analyze where is the gap between engagement between your, you know, ethnic minority groups, because taking ethnicity is a great way to tap into all the other aspects of identity, because it's so interlinked. If you hit ethnicity, you're automatically going to unravel some things about that person if you start to learn about their lived experience. And then you'll find ways to get them to socially engage. And I find creating spaces for social engagement is a very soft and gentle approach to introducing people from different cultures and communities. You can center it around festivals, you can center it around social, common, you know, social celebrations, whatever makes it easy. And then you need one or a group of facilitators in that group that will get people talking and engaging with each other. This is something that I found really, really useful in Lincoln, given how white and how underexposed the student population was. They did want to, but they were fearful because they didn't know, and it was from a good place. They didn't know how to you know, if they said something to somebody of you know, a Muslim faith, would they be misunderstood? Would they have offended them? So they just didn't engage at all. And it was the same thing with teachers. It was the same thing when it came to mocking and assessing. You know, if it's not something I understand, I will automatically think it's not great, so I won't even go there. So the feedback started to vary, and the feedback wasn't great. You would get short comments, doesn't help you learn, student gets disengaged, doesn't feel like they belong, their performance drops, they drop out. So this was a cycle that was going around with not just, you know, educators, but also students. And because Lincoln is such a stark example, testing the waters there was easy. So I find social engagement is a great way, because if you can engage with the parents and the parents of students who are from different communities, whatever those communities may be, I find we do too much to reach only students and only, you know, and not everybody, but, you know, generally speaking, I don't think we're working as hard to educate parents to move with the moving times. I think a lot of parents are stuck where they are stuck, and they believe very strongly in that view. But there's not enough community initiatives to actually reach them. And I think if you can bridge some of those gaps through good social facilitated conversations, you can maybe shift the dial a little bit. But that's just from personal experience, and, you know.
I think I don't have time to ask, but this is a very important question from my perspective. As soon as I ask that question, you guys take a crack at it, then we shift to the audience to begin to ask the question, because now they are turn. But let me just use 1 minute. Beverly Daniel Tatum talked about Black kids sitting at the cafeteria alone. And that concept of sitting at the cafeteria alone had been misconceptualized by some, especially those in the majority. They saw it as, you know, either planning something or doing something bad. But as I told my students that when it comes to sitting alone, everyone, I don't care whether you are majority or minority or wherever you come from, even animals too, they tend to go to people they see that they can say, well, I know this person, instead of someone who they don't know. I remember a time when I used to travel a lot, we got to a place and one of my colleagues said, why are these people taking the car to park where they're going to do activities, that is, they want to do exercise? The other one say, it's only Americans that do that. And as we are saying there, someone drove by that place and came there and said, I got a good spot. So when he said that, it really aligned with the earlier discussion we were having before the person came. Although it's not connected with human beings, but it has been sort of ingrained in those who we are speaking that these people are like that, which is not necessarily generalizable, but from their perspective, that's how they see it. So my question is, how do you do this? How do you begin this collaboration? As you indicated quite well, when people are grown, they form their belief system, the fear has been developed, the people they can align with or people they will not trust, all those things have all developed. Now, when it comes to school, how do you begin to do this? Because I think it's very crucial that we find a way to begin to do this, because I think that's the crux of everything, including systemic diversity group. My hitting is that engagement has to occur. So could you comment on that, please?
Jennifer, would you like to go first? You all right if I comment?
No, you go first this time. And I didn't know other people might
I'm not
have
a panelist. I'm not a panelist. So you ladies go, take it on.
Okay, it's going to sound really funny, I'm going to say this, but it did manage to get about 740 staff and students into this, in through the doors when, you know, Lincoln as a university had never managed to get more than maybe 5-10 people through engaging with each other. So I'm going to give this example as something I also believe And I found very, very, very simple way of connecting with people. So we are often looking for, you know, structures and strategies and action plans and so on. But I think we forget that we're all humans, and the simplest way of cross-connecting is over food, is over music, is over social engagement, is over creating an environment that feels friendly enough, and how you actually promote and get people to come and visit that environment. That's really key. But all of that starts with authentic engagement, and it starts with regular engagement, and starts with gaining trust. So somebody's going to have to take the first step. Someone is going to have to decide that I'm going to go and speak to a person that is part of X community, and I'm going to propose this idea that, look, I want to, you know, I want to talk about all these issues that are affecting us, and I want to have an event, or I want to have a conversation, or whatever. And you go from there. You will come up against barriers, but from having done that across 15,000 students and 3,000 plus staff, I can tell you it is doable. It is possible. You know, it's not, it takes a lot of work. It took me about 6 months, 4 to 6 months to shift that dial, to get people trusting me when I am a complete outsider in their space. So if I take again the example of Lincoln, I'm Indian, Hindu. I grew up in Dubai. I went to school in Dubai, lived there for 30 years. I worked for 16 years in Dubai. Then I moved to Lincoln. I'm there for just 2 years. I'm not white. I sound different. I dress different. I look different. They can't place my accent. They don't know which way I sit. It was equally hard reaching my white colleagues as it was my BAME colleagues, Black and Asian minority ethnic colleagues. It was incredibly easy reaching the white minority ethnic colleagues because they'd never had anyone take an interest in actually understanding what they were struggling with. But I think it's all about wanting to approach people on a human basis and understand where are their pain points. Where are the pain points? Where can we work together? You don't have to carry the burden. I will do this. I will find ways to influence the organization. I'll find ways to challenge the status quo. I just want you to feel you're safe, and I want you to share what you've experienced, what you are struggling with. And, you know, if you want to be part of the solution, that's an option too. But let's just start there. But it's really important you don't shift the burden of fixing the problem to the community that is struggling. And this was something that, you know, I realized organizations top down always do. They'll find a BAME person, they'll make them the lead, and suddenly they're responsible for fixing this massive problem that hasn't been fixed for decades. They have no resources, they have no space to influence, they're not strategically placed. So I think all of those things, you have to have those courageous conversations, you know, as Jennifer and David said, and you need to come up, constantly be moving and shifting with what's being thrown at you, and just try and reach people on a human level. But it is doable, and it does work. It takes time.
And I would second as well that it can't just be one event, right? It can't just be, oh, we've got this special month or this special activity. It has to be weaved into the daily operation. Yeah. David had a comment in here about trust. The best way to earn trust, and like Seba, but you know, it's somewhat different. I came to a community where, you know, I'm not a person of color. I'm not from this community. I've only been here about 2 years, and to build that trust, I had to break out of my comfort zone. So I share that there is a high crime rate, and there are certain areas of town that people associate with the crime, right? There are certain zip codes. And so I realized that if I was going to be a real genuine advocate of change and of engagement, that meant that as part of a resident of this city and the children that I was serving and representing, I had to be there. And so I began to, you know, I'm a big proponent. I'm an English lit major. And so I believe in the city as text. And if you don't know your community, if you don't worship with them, if you aren't comfortable being the only person, if you aren't comfortable being the minority, the only person of you know, and switching or flipping that switch, why should anyone else be? So, you know, I had to break down any barriers I had and go to streets and zip codes and places that other people might say, oh, that's dangerous or that's uncomfortable. Good, great people live there every day. The young people that I was tasked to serve with, these are their homes. These are their learning environments. And I know, you know, you share that, Tabitha, about, you know, having enough to eat and having your basic needs met. And if we are judging, I mean, I have one young lady I was over a student internship program, and invariably at the end of the day, she would always just happen to be there and she needed a ride home. And so I would drop her off and I said, well, I want to meet your mom. She said, oh no, Dr. Blaylock, you can't come in my house. And I said, you know what my house looked like when I grew up. I said, I would love to meet your mom. I want to meet her. And so I always make sure that I talk to her mom, you know, and in me sharing some of my story and my vulnerability, you know, people make assumptions. And I think it's about conversations. You don't have to have an event. You don't have to have, okay, at 2 p.m. today, I'm going to be inclusive. No, it needs to be integrated and woven into your whole experience. And it starts with one conversation. It starts with one event out of your comfort zone. It starts with going to a place that you're not necessarily familiar or comfortable with and learning. And the more you go there, the more you have that shared experience. And it's also about listening. So you also, I mean, how many times have we tasked somebody or created a committee? We are notorious for that in higher education. We put a label on it. But we have a committee for that. They're taking care of that problem. No, it's still a problem. It's still a silo if we are just saying that this population of people who are on this committee, these 7 people, have to fix it for the entire 55,000, you know, person campus community. That's never going to make change. We all have to take that level of ownership, of culpability, and take the time to be part of the solution. And so that means, again, asking ourselves those hard questions and really digging deep into what in daily practice, how we're not contributing or really living the mission. We have a lot of special programs to help our first generation college students, our vulnerable populations in colleges and universities, but we label them. You know, we have our non-traditional students, we have our student athletes, we have all the, you know, our students with disabilities or learning. And at the end of the day, there's so much we have in common. We all have a desire to learn. We all want to create a safe and inclusive community where we're transforming our lives through shared knowledge, through curiosity, exploration, and research. And in doing that, we're all the same, but we should be celebrating the differences that make us unique outside of that. So I think we try to put people in boxes, and it can't work anymore, you know. And I've shared how, you know, I've been an advocate for my daughter. I had to check myself. I mean, I still have to check myself about a lot of different things, but I remember vividly, she was in, elementary. And I always loved school. You know, I grew up very, very poor, so I loved the library, right? Like that was my thing. She's an athlete. She loves being out there on the field. She's a soccer player. And so I was trying to teach her how to read, and I thought I was brilliant. I was like, I got this. And so I kept saying the same things, but in different ways and creative ways. And I realized not only was she not processing it, she has a learning disability that includes processing, short-term, long-term memory and recall, and lots of different things. And I have permission to share that. But at any rate, I realized that she learns differently. And that doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean that she is as smart as anybody. Just like we're all smart in different ways, and we bring those different gifts and talents. And so we're still grading people by tests and exams. And we say we have project-based learning, and we say we want to embrace online learning. And yet here we are, and it was a transition. You know, I teach a graduate course in leading change. And again, it continues to amaze me. I wrote an article about it. Why you talked about status quo. So education, we have been doing the same thing for centuries and expecting different results. And it's not to say there aren't some foundational pieces of the structure of education that work. Yes, they do. And they work for some people, but they don't work for everybody. And so we need to allow people to architect and create and navigate their own educational journey. And I'll just share real quickly. I remember because of my daughter, you know, I've looked at all kinds of different schools trying to find that perfect match. And so I went to a Montessori school, and I left there crying. And I'll tell you why. These kids with their self-directed learning were doing physics in like 2nd grade and just running with it, right? And I thought, oh my gosh, she would be so far behind. She wouldn't know what to do if she was given this much freedom and liberty and the ability to pursue what she was passionate about. And now I look back on the experience that I've had in working in higher education, and the students who have been the most successful are the ones who have found their passion, ignited it, and aligned that passion with their educational journey. And my doctorate was on completion. What are those predictive analytics? You know, we keep looking at all these things that will keep somebody from graduating. Why don't we instead focus on the assets that they have that will empower their graduation and completion? And then why don't we define what completion or success means based on their terms, not on our terms? Not that they have a diploma, which of course we want them to have, but maybe that's not their journey. Maybe that's not their dream. Maybe it's a longer journey than 2 years or 4 years. And we need to respect that and embrace it. All right, I'm off my.
Thank you so
brilliant.
much.
Can I add something to that, Joseph?
Okay. Okay. After that, then the audience. go ahead.
I'll try and be brief for my struggle.
Okay.
But I just want to say I absolutely agree with where you're coming from, Jennifer. And I think, you know, it's so interesting that we've defined success, but we've not actually questioned where these definitions have originated from. We rarely spend our life questioning our social and cultural conditioning, our parental conditioning. We just kind of almost observe and repeat, and you know, unless we break down or something forces us to consider it, like the current pandemic, we don't actually re-examine what are we replicating by way of information or content that we're consuming. So I think you're absolutely right. You know, we need to start thinking more, whether it's workplaces or students, we need to start thinking that everybody is built differently. So if we look at everyone as a complete human being who wants to be their true self, nobody wants to be unhappy and be fixed into boxes. You know, that's not human nature. That's not nature that we observe outside of us. So if we want to do that, then we need to come up with more individualized ways. But it's so much easier if we just start to look at solution development rather than, oh my God, we have so many barriers because there's so many complexities. It's like, you know, we're all vulnerable the same. We're all struggling with the same similar things. We're all, you know, feeling like we can't cope with similar things, just in different contexts. So it's just a case of bringing those contexts together and conversations and, you know, starting to, like you said, look at ourselves as well and keep ourselves in check and constantly learning about the other person or where they're coming from is a great way just to start to get more comfortable what is different to us.
Thank you very much. And the floor is open for participants. And if you are one of the 11 participants, thank you for joining us. And you can come up with your question for our August guests.
I'd like to ask a question with sort of a point. My name is Flynn Busey, and once again, I'm glad to be here. I have a PhD, and I've taught both in university settings and in professional development settings and in other kind of situations. And my sense, well, I'm going to skip over the notion that the system is working more or less the way it was designed, which is to keep the barriers in place that hold up the top. And it's working. The problem is it's not sustainable, and it's not just, and it's not optimal. I'm gonna put that aside. And to me, the question I'm struggling, you know, is, to me, it's not so much about teaching, it's about learning. And we don't ever teach. There's not, I mean, some of you are experts, but I mean, we had classes on learning how to learn. You know, we learn this, we learn that, we learn something else, but we assume that learning capacity and importantly, the learning desire. If you can't force somebody to learn. Just putting information in front of people doesn't equal learning. And we all know that. I'm preaching to the choir here. But I think, you know, we probably said teaching 500 times in the last hour, and we probably said learning 5. And when we said learning at least 2 or 3 of those, it was when the teachers needed to learn. And as we've said, learning is not something you do when you're a kid. You know, half of growing up is unlearning the stuff you learned wrong or dysfunctionally that doesn't serve you well. It's learning to undo those layers of culture that confuse our unique self as somehow different than everybody else's unique self. And anyway, I think it's really important to turn education or teaching, reorient toward, we're all in a new dynamic where the status quo is not an option. Desperation has us struggling to go back up the river where we're comfortable. That, comfort has become a most highly held value in our culture. You can't learn. I mean, uncomfort is always a prerequisite to learning, because you got to do it different. When we do new things, we're not that good at them until we learn how to do them. Anyway, I just want to reorient that and ask the question, how do you think we can reorient that from teaching stuff to empowering learning from, the students, the teachers, the system, the culture?
Sure. So I think that's a great question, Flynn. It's funny, since the pandemic has happened, I've been on like a really structured schedule. And so I go for a bike ride and I go for a long walk each day, either like at the beginning or the end. And I have my best thoughts on my walks, and I try and, not crash and do things. And so yesterday I was thinking that I wanted to stop calling students and focus more on learners, right? Because when we think of the idea of a student, like no one really calls ourselves students once we graduate. We think of students as like a sort of a transitional period that we were K-12. We think of it a very traditional way. And so that's why we measure it. So I was thinking about the measures, right? And so look at the higher ed experience right now. All of those measures that we had in place are not going to be met, right? Retention. Our students their worlds have been thrust upon. So our retention rates are probably not going to be so great, or they're going to be impacted, whether it's this semester, next semester, et cetera. Then look at our enrollment, which is another predictive measure or KPI that we have in place. We have people whose lives have been upended. And so we're measuring all these things. So in my opinion, we look at these artificial factors. We have defined the success, like Sab and I have been talking about. And until we say that it can't just all be quantitative, it can also be qualitative. But then the challenge becomes the performance-based funding. And if that's the way we get the money to be creative and support the learning institution, then that creates it's one hand washes the other, right? Like it's this vicious cycle. So we've got to upend that. We've got to disrupt it so that we can focus. We fancy ourselves learning-centered institution. I challenge you to go out to colleges and they will have that in their mission statement. They will have it on the wall. They will have taken the course and the certificate that they're a learning-centered organization. And yet they are teaching to tests. They are teaching to competencies. And you almost can't blame them for that because of the funding model, but also because of this real focus on, we have to have credentials. And I agree with those things. I do think there has to be some sort of tangible way to demonstrate, yes, I am a nurse. Yes, I can perform these functions. But we live in extremes. In my era, it was about the liberal arts. And I have a liberal arts degree. And now that's like, I wrote a paper in college. I remember that liberal is not a 4-letter word, right? Like we learned for the sake of learning. And then our generation couldn't get jobs. So then the other end of the spectrum was our graduates have to get jobs. They have to be career ready. So, and I see utility in both of that. But I think that as we look at the 21st century workforce skills, they aren't just one position, right? We're no longer just going to be in one career. We might be in one career sector or cluster, but we've got to have agility and flexibility and creativity and communication skills, critical thinking, collaborative learning, all of the things that aren't just learned in an electrical engineering course, right? Certainly the subject matter is important, but we need to focus on what people call soft skills. I hate that word. I call them power skills or essential skills. Those are the things that will empower and inform our students, our learners, the ability, and it's not a period, it's a continuous cycle. And if people start to embrace that, we're going to have a tremendous number across the world of displaced workers. And many of them will not have career sectors to go back to, right? They've been disrupted, they've been changed, they will be upended. So in order for them to never be in that position again, how do they future-proof their career? They do it by never stopping learning. by embracing the only label that we can, that change is inevitable, it's the only constant, and that the only way to prepare for change is to be able to pivot through continuous lifelong learning. And so that's how I think you make that transition. It's a cultural shift, it's a paradigm shift.
I agree with you, Jennifer. And I think, Flynn, you're absolutely spot on. And I think the reason we often talk about teachers more is because we look at teachers as the ones that are creating the learning. But again, you know, this is the other point of self-reflection. We never stop to think that actually as human beings, we're natural learners. We're always assimilating information, observing information, analyzing it, using it to protect ourselves or, you know, to interact with somebody or not. And you know, what we pick and choose is all based on learning. But I think because of how funding systems, structures, power, you know, and where power sits and who holds the power, and who defines that power. You know, for me, unfortunately, in my lived experience, it has been a very ethnically defined thing, and I think in different contexts it is different. So whoever defines the power defines the outcomes, and whatever the outcome is, we define all the ways to reach that outcome. So you almost cannot break that system unless, like Jennifer said, you break what we reward. We've got to change what we reward. We've got to change that, you know, we don't reward universities for creating people who only think in certain ways. We reward universities because they're going to create civic-minded individuals who are up to speed with the real world, who think that actually globalization and learning different skills and being able to work with diverse populations of the world is a good thing. You know, we create learners from that. So we change what we reward, because if we decide to figure out where that power lies and how to change those funding options or those reward options, then we'll automatically start to break down and disrupt that system downwards. But that is a tough bit, because people in power generally don't want to shift their perspective because they're benefiting and somebody somewhere has a political or some other advantage. But I think, you know, discussions like these, stories, sharing learning, sharing stories, sharing write-ups, sharing your insight, I think these are all really good starting points. And I think the situation now, it makes it right for us to actually put all of this out into the world, and try and collectively use our platforms and our efforts to give it the you know, the mainstream focus that it needs. But it starts slowly, and I think I agree with you, Jennifer. I think this is where it starts.
Wonderful.
Well, I also thought this was an hour, so I'm going to check out. But it has been delightful listening to this conversation, and I look forward to participating in further such gatherings. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, David.
You're welcome. Well, it's good to have all of you, and you know, you can, if you want to continue. Otherwise, if you want to end, I think we still have some people at the audience. If they have questions, they can, you know, maybe ask questions until our guests get tired. Usually, I want to end in 1.5 hours, but you know, do you have? I think there's some people sitting there. If you're one of the participants, you can ask our guests questions.
I would like to just thank the panel very, very much indeed. It's been inspiring, enlightening. Sorry. I don't say that lightly. I'd like to throw a couple of things out there and just see what everybody says. They are disparate. They are apparently unrelated. And if you see a thread, I would like to just get a quick few seconds from everybody. When I was about 8, when I was about 8 years old, I was in a primary school in Zambia. My parents are from Guyana. We were expatriates as we called it, in Africa. But we were not white expatriates, we were black expatriates in what was in those days about 1968. One of the children in the class once said to the teacher, "Madam, we know where Sedley and his brothers and sisters come from. They are some of this stupid one got caught." Children are instinctive. They have an ability to pinpoint with unerring accuracy things from which we shy away, things which we refuse to explain and share with one another, and things which we cover up with clever ideas, labels, words, branding, and power. So without any other explanation other than that comment from an 8-year-old child in a class where I was also an 8-year-old child, I will then ask the following, which is one of my colleagues, or one of the people with whom I share a great deal, is a doctor of education, effectively, here in the UK. And what he's been sharing with me as a professional in the technical learning space in industry, so I'm not really in education in any way, shape, or form, is the following. British universities have spent such a lot of time focusing on outcomes which they require that they haven't spent any time on the input from their incredibly talented audience. As a result of which, for me as a technical specialist in Microsoft, it makes me angry that the one place that collaboration, I won't say technical collaboration or even digital, but collaboration should be blossoming at a time like this. The areas which should be leading the world in not bringing us out of the lockdown, but showing us how to work with one another. The places that should be doing that are the institutions of learning. And as Mr. Flynn just said, we haven't mentioned learning. That 8-year-old child had learnt a lot from her or his history, and they compiled it in a few words. Why are our universities spending time with Zoom, with Teams, with all these tools without actually A, using them properly, or B, showing their communities how to use them, so people look at Word, Excel, PowerPoint as though it was 6 months ago or 2 years ago, and they look at collaboration as being audio conferencing, which it's not. We could switch all these cameras off and leave the audio on, have an incredibly in-depth conversation, share content, share documents, co-edit in real time, as though we were at a table in a meeting. What? Sorry, but I'm going off topic. I'm going off thing here because I'm angry. Why the fuck are we not doing that for our communities that desperately need work, that desperately need to generate revenue, that desperately need the confidence to know that when they push a button, they're pushing the right button? We have the skills, but within the institutions themselves, we don't seem in this time to be doing that. Can anybody tell me why? Because I don't get it.
I would, if it's all right, Jennifer, I would love to tackle that one, because I completely feel your anger. I feel your pain. I feel that space that you've been in. I was an 8-year-old, 8-year-old that when I moved to Dubai, and I was among Indian students who, you know, I sounded and looked different from, because they're from different parts of India. So I have also had some of the same labels. I've had the same sort of thing from teachers, whether it's around, you know, how fat you are, or visibly differentiating you from the rest, or how you sound, because I grew up in a multinational community, so I always sounded different. My accent's never been from anywhere. So I understand where you're coming from. And I think for me, the last 2 years in UK, after having worked in Dubai on global projects, working with people on audio, transferring and outsourcing and offshoring an entire HR department for 9 countries, all done on Skype, all the training done on Skype, because they wouldn't pay for me to go, but they would pay for my managers to go because they were white British. So these are just normal things. These are normal aspects of everyday working in countries that, you know, are still growing and learning, and there is a very defined ethnic hierarchy. But to your point around why are educational institutions in the UK particularly not doing this, and I struggle with the same thing in India as well, is that they are quite happy with the status quo, because the status quo means power is maintained. They are so resistant to change and learning, and there's such a lack of diverse voices at senior leadership, right at the top of the institutions, within professorships, within lectureships. Most of our BAME, and you can look at the numbers on Advanced HE, which is a great educational institute resource. You can look at some of the numbers. Our BAME Black and Asian minority ethnic staff are not at senior leadership positions. They are most often on short-term contracts. They are not extended or made permanent in the same ways. There's a lot of institutional and deep-rooted bias. There's a lot of covert racism. That means that people who are minorities don't feel they have the power or the privilege to be able to speak up. When you don't feel that you can speak up, or only a few of you speak up and are labeled as aggressive, or as using inappropriate language or tone, or as you know, being very passionate, but you're dealing with a micro incivility or a microaggression there. When this happens to you once, twice, thrice, or every day in different interactions, you tend to stop challenging the system and you just go with whatever the system is. Now, people at the top are not technologically minded. Sadly, I think the UK in itself, my observation from just the last 2 years, and I could be completely wrong, there are pockets of people who are so technologically sound and savvy, but they exist in the private organization more so than public institutions. There is a civil service thinking mentality that, you know, the more administration and the more work and bureaucracy we create around this, the better we look. The better we look, we'll look like a big organization. So let's just create the structure that actually, you know, presents us as something worth investing in. Or look how huge we are, because that's what's going to attract funding, learners, people who want to work with us. It's completely misguided, but because there are no diverse voices at the top or in influential positions, none of these things get challenged. You can challenge it because, you know, you know the value of it. But most people will try and challenge, they'll fail, they'll get so, they'll have such a negative lived experience, and they'll get so emotionally impacted because this is yet another thing in their entire life of lived experience that is so, you know, so frustrating that they'll choose not to engage. And when the BAME or diverse thinkers or diverse community is so small and not in power, you cannot shift an institutionally defined, systemically, you know, unequal system. You cannot shift it. It will shift if the carrot is changed. It will shift. The government says, you know what, you're not going to get funding for your students and for whatever you do until you actually modernize this, this, and this. You are not going to get funding until X% of your programs are taught online. And there are universities in London, like King's College London, who have entire degrees that are taught online, not face-to-face, absolutely maximizing that. They have empowered teams and systems in place to encourage that engagement. But again, the more diverse you are and the more voices you let in, the more effective your solutions are going to be. And for the bulk of the UK, the diversity is limited by cities, or it's limited in different ways by power structures and so on. And unfortunately, that's the biggest barrier I've come up against, and it's the most frustrating barrier. So one of the ways to work is actually to look at, you know, proposals for government and so on. But again, you've got a government that is not as diverse and may or may not go anywhere. So it is hard, and which is where I think narratives, which is where I think now is an appropriate time to reach out to different news channels to try and get into the mainstream with these narratives. Because when people see your frustration or somebody else's frustration, and they see the pain that these systemic inequalities and these age-old backward systems cause, that is what shifts is because it's visual. In those institutions, it's not visual. And when it's not visual and it becomes unknown, it becomes easy to ignore. So I think visibility of that story, of that pain is necessary to shift certain narratives. But it's a hard one to shift because they don't really want to change. Thank you.
Adam, thank you so much for sharing those emotional things. I had just finished with a professor they wanted to kick out, and the professor was one of the best. And my report has helped to sustain that person who I think was one of the best. But some people didn't like her. I don't know if it's because she's, I hate to say it, she's South American and she teaches Spanish language. And so there are many people who see all those things and the emotions that tend to go with all those things are immense. You cannot even imagine. So thank you so much for sharing.
I think, I just wanted to share real quickly. I think that literacy and knowledge are power, and the power structure is such that you look at digital literacy, right? So one thing I would say in the school district that I'm at, which is a ton of Title I schools, free and reduced lunch, that kind of thing. We were able to, in no short order, distribute laptops and technology, free hotspots and Wi-Fi access to families very, very quickly. Why haven't we been doing that all along, right? Why did it take the COVID-19 crisis to make that happen? And so I think, again, necessity is one of the best teachers, but we've got to start integrating because, I often look back, my daughter is amazed that I didn't have a telephone growing up, right? So she just, oh my God, and she was put upon that in 9th grade, she didn't have an iPhone, and so I share with her, but I think back to, with my socioeconomic status, that divide of not having a phone would have been not having a computer and not having the internet. And these kids are coming to school, as Tabitha shared, with not even having food and their basic needs and security met. And yet we think, well, they have a phone or they get to play with a phone. That's not digital literacy. That's not empowering. Now, it's breaking down barriers so they at least have access and they have some comfort level. We then need to let them see and build that bridge to how does this apply to me being an entrepreneur? How does this apply to me being an educated, engaged citizen of my school and interactive? And how can I learn math from gamification? And how can I learn coding so that I can create my own games and all the things that kids keep them engaged? Why aren't we building those bridges and connections so that they can then see all that's possible? We're not. We're perpetuating the systems and the structures that keep them in place, and we're not leveraging the opportunities that allow and invite people to celebrate and achieve in new and exciting ways. And so unlocking that for people it's a responsibility, in my opinion, of education. And it really starts with taking all those labels away. And, all the things I remember, I've been around long enough, and Joseph, I know you and I can both remember as instructors when we were like, nobody's bringing their phone into the classroom and cell phones are terrible and all these kind of things. And now, again, I think we're always so resistant to it, but we've got to integrate it. We've got to say, here's your cell phone, use it for good. You're on that thing all the time. That's okay. If we didn't have FaceTime right now, if we didn't have Snapchat and all these social media mechanisms that everybody's using now, that we as the older people, and I'm in that crew that's been, oh, that's not quality communication, that we've had all these judgments and reservations about it. And yet now, oh, we love it, right? Now it's great. We always resist what we don't know. And we have this sense of arrogance about it. And we've got to strip that away. I mean, if we're not open to learning new things, then we're not really educators. And that's a responsibility that I take very seriously. And again, I have to check myself on those things as well, because, oh, I have to learn a new system. Oh, it's a new thing. New is not bad. Advances, we've got to try, we've got to fail, we've got to explore, and we've got to create access and opportunities for everybody to see real substantive impact of technology. And so I believe in open internet. I believe in open Wi-Fi for everybody. I think it should be publicly funded. I believe in open access, publicly funded higher education. I believe that education should be open source, and that people should be able to start navigating and architecting their own futures. And, the sky's the limit, but we've got to give them that foundational piece where they're guaranteed a safe place to live, and health insurance, and a safe environment, and food to eat, those kinds of things. And that's going to be more critical than ever based on all the impact. And it's going to be not just 6 months, 3 months, it's going to be years that we're still going to feel the impact of the economic challenges that we face now.
I agree. And I think,
Wow.
sorry, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the things that I think is a tragedy is that there are schools that have been doing that. My son is privileged enough. We worked very hard to get into a community that focused on disabilities for our older child, and provided better care. And we live in an area that we really can't afford because he needed that, and we knew the importance of him being able to get a good education. But my youngest has very much benefited from that because he's going to school where they were doing distance learning before this was an issue. They could take extra classes. They have some core classes, but there's half of their schedule is exploring job opportunities. They have opportunities that a lot of kids never have. I'm looking at the way he's doing school is the way I did college, and he's just in high school. And so when we had to transition, they literally did it over a weekend, and they had everything set up and ready to go. And there were a couple kids who got like 3 or 4 days because they had more than one family member in the home, so they needed to get a laptop from school and check it out. But they were given that delay, and then it was up and running, and it was no problem. And then I listened to some of my friends who, particularly in the South, are talking about, we're getting packets that we have to print because they can't do the packet online because we don't have the software to be able to have them fill it out. The schools didn't set it up right. And so they're having to print it. They don't have a printer in their home. They can't go to Staples. What are they supposed to do? And it just breaks my heart, because how hard is it to do Microsoft PDF? And I've had to walk several of my friends through how to do that. The school system hasn't given them those resources. We had people that were offering Zoom training to show parents how to use the software that the kids are using, because the kids already know how to use it, but the parents didn't know how to keep up with stuff. And they taught the parents in our district. That's what they were doing. And I'm like, why isn't everybody else getting the exact same care and concern? Because they're not in a wealthy, predominantly white district.
Yep.
And that makes me ill.
Oh yeah. So it all goes back to funding. How we fund perpetuates the power structure. So you started it off, and said, basically, because you live in a school district, because it has those services, right? Yep. Publicly funded education should have a standard of excellence across the board, right?
100% agree.
I do a keynote where I talk about my 3 least favorite words in the English language became parent-teacher conference. And I'm an educator. So the reason I say that is because my daughter, with her learning disabilities and differences, every year was a challenge. She didn't fit the norm. And so guess what? Every call I got or invitation to meet a parent or have a parent-teacher conference was a negative. It was, as I shared before, she's not going to pass this grade. She's not doing this. She's not sitting in that box, right? Until I realized this had to be a collaboration. It wasn't an us versus them. And I think what happens for kids who learn differently. And that goes across the gamut. I have to tell you, in working with non-traditional, which I hate that word, but any student who didn't, start on that traditional at 18, right? So really all learners, but learning or supporting students who are of older ages, et cetera, I guarantee you they have undiagnosed learning differences, learning styles that are not being respected or honored. Do you know how much it costs to go see a psychometrist or to be tested for some of those? I mean, we primarily test for, some basic reading pieces. We had to basically take Bailey to a private assessment so that she could be fully evaluated. Not everybody has that opportunity. And
Oh
so,
yeah, it took us 7 years to get my son's diagnosis.
right. And so that,
And even then, most school districts, they're like, our special needs program is for mentally retarded kids, and your kid is a genius, but he has
right.
problems with organization. We don't have a program to help you. And I was
Right.
like, that is not acceptable. And I was even willing to do the work with him. I was like, look, I'll come and get his homework assignments from class. I'll turn them in. He'll do the work with me,
Right.
guys. And they were like, we can't really do a customized program like that. It's not fair to our teachers. And I was like, that's really sad. But when those classrooms had 46 kids per classroom, I get it. It isn't fair to them. Here, when we moved out here, 20 kids in the classroom was the most. And most of them, they had 16 to 18 kids. And so it was worth living outside our means to be able to get him that access. But we, again, very privileged, two educated people who both have degrees, who were both working and able to fight for him because we had the knowledge of how to fight for him and because we had the income to be able to fight for him. There are so many people who could never do what we did. And it's not fair that they don't get the same opportunities just because they didn't know,
If I could, I
Can
absolutely agree
I
with you.
jump in?
Oh, no, go ahead, Tabitha.
As a special education teacher working in K through 12, like I said, you all have said so many layers. You've talked about so many things that we don't have enough time to discuss all of that. But what I want to say is when you consider the child that is not fitting into the bell-shaped curve, into the typical bell part, and they're the outlier, I just want to add, when we write those IEPs and they have to be identified by law, and then they have to go through the testing, but that has to be, the parents have to want that, right? And not all parents want their children to be labeled. So put that into the sphere of thought. And then once that child is labeled, it is not just one label necessarily, but maybe we've got behavior issues because their family is poor and they're moving around and around and they're on drugs and they're not being able to provide what that child needs to be an effective learner or to sit in a seat for more than 20 minutes, right? And so you've got all these layers to these children, and then you've got the school's agenda and the district's agenda and the state's agenda and the federal government's agenda, and everyone has needs, and it's so complicated, and it's not just an easy fix. And it's disheartening to see that when I was in special ed, we couldn't identify every kid because now the district was being watched. Why do you have so many special needs? Like, what's going on here? What does this mean? And then you have districts that are privileged, so they have a little more resources. So those parents are smart, so we don't want to upset them. So let's make sure that those resources are there. And these parents, just hand them the parent rights, right? And let's see if they read those. And then we'll see if we have a fire to put out, right? It's just so many layers. It's complicated. And I just wanted to identify some of those layers you all were talking about, just so they were aware.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think when you factor in faith and different cultures, you'll find that there's even more resistance, especially if there's mental health issues or struggles and so on and so forth. My parents are very progressive, but it's taken them a while to come to terms with, oh, wow, I struggle with anxiety, or I struggle with severe depression, or that I can't cope. And, sometimes I will need medication to be able to cope. So I think this, you know, for me, what stands out most is that, one, it shouldn't be a postcode lottery. Two, we have so many resources available and so much collective knowledge, but because we're so caught in this sort of hamster wheel of whatever we are, you know, stuck in, or we've got to do X to meet Y to meet Z, that we don't stop and question the system we're in. We also don't think in terms of inclusive mindsets and inclusive teaching and learning practices. So, you know, for me, it's strange. If we just provided for the lowest common denominator, like basically if we started to think, okay, what do all of these things have in common? So, you know, a good video is always got captions or subtitles, you know, always has a transcript. If you start to provide already for people who would, you know, struggle with some things, you'll find that by designing your solution to meet the needs of many, you know, or even the few that are the outliers, if you do outlier-based solution design, you're actually going to hit all the needs of the majority automatically.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
whether
what I've
those things
always
exist
said.
or not.
Special education isn't special anymore. Accommodations and modifications
Yeah.
for all. Then I would be out of a job and I'd be like, yay.
Well, not necessarily, because, you know, you bring expertise, and I think this is why it doesn't happen, because
Right.
a lot of people are stuck in fearing that I'll be out of a job, so keep it specialized. You know, and I know you're saying it from a nice perspective, but believe me, at least if I speak of India or UK or other places, there are a lot of educators who don't want the change and don't want to adapt. They want to stay stuck in reactive thinking and reactive working and where they are, because that means they will have a job. So we're so survival driven that even when we could be doing things faster, better, quicker, very often we'll be quite happy to pick and choose which part of the system works for us and it doesn't. And this thing, and I think, you know, for me, what stood out as both a student and a staff member in an educational institution is that the real reasons we're actually teaching and worrying about access and participation, worrying about, you know, attainment gaps is not because we actually care why these students are struggling. We are actually doing it because the Board of Governors or Ofsted or some government body is actually going to question us. So we are working because of a stick. And I think that attitude really needs to shift. You know, education needs to shift the gear on it. And hopefully this will give us that opportunity, fingers crossed.
I'm
And I
really
think-
sorry to play the bad cop, and this is the thing I hate the most. Unfortunately, I have to do it. So I wanna our panelists to make some closing remarks, because we have another session coming up rather very quickly. Otherwise, all you're saying is sounding like music in my ears that I don't even want it to end. So if you could begin, I will appreciate it.
Absolutely. Should I go first, Jennifer?
Sure. Yes.
I'll try and be short. I just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity. I think, you know, it's so important to have discussions like these and to share bits and pieces of our lived experience, whether it's as parents, as learners, as educators, or as, you know, observers of what's going absolutely wrong in our environments, because whether we have children or not, in some form or shape, we are learners. And what we interact with and what we choose to interact with and create, I think that defines the change that we will be able to see in the world. So I think these kind of forums are brilliant. I would love to have more collaborative outcomes and working partnerships out of this, because even if it is to put what we're saying, it shouldn't stop at this. I think, you know, we need to find ways where we can cross those boundaries over different geographies, because what America struggles with, what the UK struggles with, what places like India and, you know, private educators in Dubai and other places struggle with, there's a lot of common themes, but we wouldn't know that if we didn't share all this knowledge. So yeah, please feel free to reach out. Please feel free to have more you know, lived experience or non-working conversations, because I think it doesn't happen often enough that we can share these things with like-minded people. And I think the pandemic has given us pause for thought. So we need to use it to not go back to what we've been stuck in. And I certainly don't want to go back to that hamster wheel. You know, I want to add more value in the world. So just putting it out there, you know, happy to be here, happy to continue engaging, and happy to support all the audience and the work that everyone is doing. And thank you for giving us this opportunity.
I just want to say one thing. To what she just said about continuing to do this, in fact, we have many other people who are completely in sync with the same thinking. So what is upon us is to continue to get together, continue to strive, and not being afraid to express these things, and together we will get to that mountain, as Martin Luther King Jr. said. Okay, Jennifer.
I just want to say what a wonderful start to Saturday morning. And of course, with the pandemic, I don't know if you guys have had any challenges knowing what day of the week it is. The beautiful thing is that every day is a day to learn, exchange, and collaborate. And I just kept thinking about how do we make decisions, right? When you look at your authentic leadership, at your core, what are those consistencies? And so say you were talking about, what brings us all together. Also, when we come from a place of fear, the decisions we make are never good, right? And so again, when we operate from a center or core of love, and that's love, acceptance, and engagement and support of each other. And that's a great thing. That's where the hope is. A friend of mine gave me the book, or recommended the book, Man's Search for Meaning, right? And I was in, right? And so by Viktor Frankl. And so when you look at that, and they did the study, right? The people who survived those challenging times of the Holocaust, many of them held on to hope. And now more than ever, and that's what education is. It's hope, it's opportunity, it's a transformation. And so nothing, in my opinion, even when numbers aren't exciting or don't meet what we want them, they should always be hopeful. They're always a call to action. And so I would take a little bit further. Yes, let's keep the conversation going, but let's keep challenging the status quo. Let's keep being positive disruptors. Let's keep challenging all of us to be more inclusive, to not just speak about it, but to live about it, to live it, to be about it. I think we all have an obligation because we see what it can look like, and we're also open to finding out what even beyond our wildest dreams. And so now is the time to dream. Now is the time to question. It's okay to question. It's okay to not be sure. It's okay to be ambiguous and have some gray, and that's okay. But again, it's going to take that courage, that authentic leadership, that collaboration, and getting out of our comfort zones. And so in doing that, innovation, change, inclusivity will continue to happen, but it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be comfortable. And it requires all of us to step up, to step out, and to keep talking and moving forward. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Look forward to your closing remarks, and I'll see you again at 1 p.m.
Thank you so much. I want to really thank all of you for making it possible.